Recently in Al-Fashir in Sudan, the world witnessed the horrific scenes of mass slaughter as thousands of innocent people lost their lives at the hands of the RSF, one of the factions of the Sudanese civil war. Horrific atrocities and crimes against humanity were committed. Perhaps what was just as shocking as these horrific scenes was not only the intentional killing and punishment and torture of innocent civilians, but alongside that, not just the complicity, but the active involvement of Muslim countries supporting factions, military groups which kill other Muslims. This highlights the complicity and the weakness of the Muslim world, including countries such as the UAE. What's going on here exactly? Why is the UAE getting involved and being complicit and actively involved in the killing of innocent people? There's a lot of explanations that can be given here. Of course, there's the economic, the political, but there's also a grander historical and civilizational theme that has to be accounted for. Why have a lot of governments within the Muslim world, within the Arab world, for example, within the North African world, why have they often been complicit and oppressive towards their own people, their own citizens? Why have they funded these wars? What exactly is it about Muslim civilization and modernity in the past 100 years that has been leading to these atrocities? In principle, Muslims are supposed to be one ummah, one nation, one civilization, so to speak, and they are supposed to take care of one another, supposed to cherish the lives and take care and uphold the dignity of each other. To understand the civilizational weakness of many Muslims, and in particular of individual Muslim states, we have to understand the history of the Muslim world in particular. Ever since the Western colonialists have invaded Muslim lands, and Muslims have suffered constant defeats and humiliation at the hands of the West and external civilizations, the Muslim world has entered into an age of crisis where it has lost its identity fundamentally. In particular, ever since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the last real unifying force within the Muslim world that united the core states of that civilization, ever since its ultimate dissolution, the Muslim world has gone through an age of crisis where it has been going through countless wars, countless divisions, has been in constant civil strife, and a lot of crises have been occurring throughout the region. This age of crisis, of course, leads to instability in certain countries, civil wars, and the kind of genocidal warlordism that we see present in Sudan right now. Dr. Carol Quigley, in his book Tragedy and Hope, mentioned in the context of Western civilization that the West had gone through multiple sort of ages of crises where the core states essentially were challenged and there were multiple conflicts within that particular civilization. And yet the West was sort of able to reorganize itself to escape those ages of crises. In a similar vein, the Muslim world has been able to overcome its own age of crises, its own internal conflicts, and reorganize itself and move past this kind of era of conflicts or periods of time where they've been embroiled in civil strifes and wars. For example, when the Mongols invaded the Muslim world and pretty much decimated half a dozen different empires and groups within that civilization, within the Muslim civilization, eventually the Muslims were able to reorganize themselves. First, the Mamluks managed to defeat the Mongols and put a stop to the invasion of the Mongols in the rest of the Muslim lands. And eventually the Ottomans came along and managed to reorganize and reunify most of the core Islamic states within its border. Of course, there was also the Shah of Iran at the time who managed to unify Persia into one land, and there was also the Mughal Empire who managed to unify the Muslim portions of India at that time. Currently, what we are witnessing in the Muslim world is an age of crisis, which one can point out quite distinctly to perhaps have begun after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, although to be fair, one can trace its roots back way earlier. This dissolution of the Ottoman Empire essentially left the Muslim world disunited and left it into various different states, various different factions that have been vying for supremacy ever since, this dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And this kind of conflict within this civilization has continued till this day. Up until a certain point, let's say in the 60s and the 70s, the forces of Western modernity were quite clearly winning within the Muslim world. However, for a various number of factors, including but not exclusive to Western influence, Western interventions, wars, conflicts, and ultimately the destabilization of these regimes, it led to the conditions required for radical Islamist and ultra nationalist groups to form. These fundamentalist groups, in many cases, then became insurgent groups and waged civil wars against their own governments. In other places, where you also saw was that the militaries of the various governments often conspired to, first of all, cement their own power within a nation, and then also to sort of coup d'etat and take over the nation entirely and replace, in many cases, what was the democratically elected leader. And this often led to military dictatorships. Obviously, an issue that arose with these was that these military dictatorships would often be the subject of assassination attempts, other coups d'etats by other factions in the military, and also these regimes, although they may have provided a sense of stability to the region, were also noted for their own very oppressive acts, their violation of human rights, and in many cases it led to an even more severe backlash from the West. We saw this, for example, in Iran. When the democratically elected leader of Iran was overthrown in the 1950s, they replaced him with the Shah. The US, the CIA, they essentially enabled for this overthrow of a democratically elected leader in another country to happen. Then, when the Shah started getting too vocal about the influence of the Israeli lobby, the influence of the West in his land, or, you know, he started getting too vocal against the interests of the USA decided to fund the Islamist revolution of the 70s, which ultimately overthrew the Shah. Interestingly enough, which is going to be a common theme throughout a lot of the histories of these insurgencies and fundamentalist groups, this Islamist group of Shia clerics was initially funded by the CIA. They were funded by the USA, and they often had relations with Israel even. And eventually, obviously, when things got sour and they turned against the USA and Israel, did things go south? But in many cases, in order to destabilize these countries, these fundamentalist groups were initially funded by the USA and by its proxy allies in the Middle East. You saw this also in Afghanistan, where we have the USSR invades Afghanistan, imposes its own proxy leader. Islamist insurgent groups are funded by the USA. Eventually, the USSR leaves, and then when these insurgent Islamist groups come to power and these attacks in the West begin to happen, the USA invades Afghanistan, it bombs it, and just, occupies it for a good amount of 20 years. Of course, all of this, whether it have been in Iraq or in Libya or in any other country, or even in the case of Sudan, where, for example, the UAE or other power players within the region are just funding both sides of the war. They're funding different militia groups, they're funding different factions of the military, further by cementing this conflict and allowing for the war to sort of progress. It's quite clear to see why this would have such a destabilizing effect in the region, and why there would not be any sort of stable democratic rule or stable form of government within the region. There's fundamentally no unifying force within this civilization. There's fundamentally no power great enough which can maintain peace within the region. And so it's a constant conflict between different groups, different nations with different interests. This then links back to what's been happening in Sudan. You see the UAE with no care at all for innocent life, with no care at all for the consequences on the country's sovereignty, the country is, you know, the quality of life that the country's residents can have, the innocent people that are being slaughtered. no care for that at all and no concern even, just funding this militia and allowing, facilitating for these brutal war crimes to occur. Hence, the conflict in the Sudan and in many places across the Muslim world, including in Palestine and even in Yemen right now, in the Congo, which is partially Muslim as well, it indicates a deeper issue within the fabric of the Muslim world, which is the lack of a unifying force and the crisis of identity and the crisis of unity that it faces as a civilization over the past century since the dissolution of the Ottomans. There's a very important prophetic saying from Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he says that there will come a time when the nations will gather upon you. And his companions ask him, well, how is that going to be? And he says, well, it's not that you are going to be small in number that day. And I'm just paraphrasing the statement, the tradition here. It's related in more detail in the books of Hadith, that it's not going to be the case that you're going to be small in number that day. There will be a lot of you. There will be a lot of Muslims, 1 billion, 2 billion Muslims in that era. But you will be weak as the foam of the ocean, meaning there will be no substance to you. That you'll be like the foam of the ocean. You'll just be swept away to the side. There's nothing of substance there. And in another tradition, I believe he did say that you will begin to love the world and you will hate death. In other words, Muslims will begin to not only, indulge in worldly pleasures and worldly desires. Not that obviously engaging with the world is a bad thing, but engaging with the lower desires and becoming too attached to material things and ignoring the suffering of other people, the suffering of their fellow brothers and sisters, the civilizational problems that they have. This is what's happening, that Muslims, Muslim governments obviously, and the leaders of the Muslim world are ignoring the civilizational problems that they're facing, the crisis of identity they have, the lack of a unifying force, the wars, the genocides occurring across the Muslim world. They're ignoring all of that, and they'd rather engage in their own material pleasure and satisfaction than actually bring about changes that can help the people of their land. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Although the events in the Sudan, the events in Palestine recently, events in Yemen, events in the Congo are incredibly disheartening, and it's an absolute tragedy to see the loss of life. And the fact that all of these kinds of genocides and acts of ethnic cleansing are happening is horrible. There is the hope that the Muslim leaders, the Muslim elites, will wake up and see to it that changes in policy, changes in politics are brought about that can help improve the lives of people. And surely, if we can bring about policies, if we can bring about changes that can save even the life of one person, of 1,000 people, of 10,000 people, it can help bring about prosperity and peace to various lands. It can help improve the quality of life of people. It can help stop people from being deprived of basic living conditions, of their basic rights to life. Then surely it would be worth the effort. Hence, of course, whilst Muslim civilization, the Muslim world right now, is currently undergoing an age of crisis, it is not out of the question that it is able to reorganize itself and become a stronger civilization and have a unifying force that will lead it into a golden age once more and an age of peace.